So in this lecture we'll be covering metallurgy, and in this page we'll be studying about the common ores in aluminium. In aluminium, zinc and iron, so you have three elements, uh, aluminium, zinc and iron. Now in each one of these few ores you have their elements, you have their respective ores. So first you have bauxite. Now bauxite's name is chemical formula is Al2O3.2H2O. So it would be helpful if you note each one of these chemical formulas down, because they would ask in the exams what is the formula of, say for example, cryolite. So this would be Na3Al(F6). Now in case they ask the chemical name for cryolite, so it would be sodium aluminium fluoride. This is quite easy. All you need to do is mention the element sodium aluminium fluoride. Then you have corundum, which is Al2O3, and this is aluminium oxide. Then we move on to the element zinc and its source. Now zinc blend, its chemical formula is ZnS. Also its chemical name is zinc sulfide. Then you have calamine, whose chemical name is zinc carbonate, and then finally you have zincite, which has the chemical formula as ZnO, and its chemical name is zinc oxide. Now let's move on to iron. Now the first alloy of iron is hematite, which is mainly the ore that is extracted profitably. So let's scroll down a bit. So the second ore of iron is Fe3O4 triiron tetroxide. The third iron ore is iron pyrites, which is FeS2, or ferric iron disulfide. And then you have spathic iron. This is spathic iron ore. So its chemical formula is FeCO3, and its chemical name is iron 2 carbonate, because both their valencies are +2. Fe is +2 and CO3 is -1. Carbonates -2. Sorry. So minerals are compounds of various metals found in nature associated with their earthly impurities. Okay. Now let's scroll down a bit. Now what are ores? Ores are basically naturally occurring minerals from which metals can be extracted profitably and conveniently. So this is a very important point which has to be mentioned in the definition of ores. There are these various keywords that have to be used in the definition, without which receiving marks would be much of a problem. So it would be advisable to use as much keywords as possible. Now let's move on to the definition of alloys. Now what exactly are alloys? Alloys are substance. It is a substance prepared by adding other metals and non-metals, mostly metals, to the base metal in appropriate conditions to obtain certain desirable properties. So say for example, if you want to make a substance which is very hard, so you would take a metal, say for example aluminium, and add some metals into it to make it much more stronger than it originally was. Now we have aluminium over here, and let's look at the properties of alloys of aluminium that make it very important. So the first alloy of aluminium is duralumin, which has aluminium as its major component, almost 95%. Then you have copper, which constitutes about 4% of its total percentage composition. Then you have magnesium, and then you have manganese. Now what are the properties? Aluminium imparts lightness and magnesium imparts strength. Now what are the uses of duralumin? It's used in aircrafts, cooker, light tools, etc. Now one of the very important features and characteristics that would be required in aircrafts is to make the material extremely light, and it should have strength so that it does not get crushed in the upper atmosphere. Then we have the second alloy of aluminium. It's known as magnesium. It has aluminium again forming almost 95% of it, and then you have magnesium, which constitutes about 5% of the entire percentage composition. Then we have properties. Now what are the properties? It is light, hard, tough, and corrosion resistant. Now, and it is used in aircrafts and scientific tools. Now let's move on to the third alloy of aluminium, also known as alnico, and consists of aluminium, nickel, cobalt and iron. Now what are the properties? It is light and shiny, it is corrosion resistant and it is used in magnets. Okay, so let's scroll down. Extraction of aluminium. So there are 2 steps to extract aluminium. Now let's look at each one of them. So step 1 is, it would be helpful if you would note this formula down. It would be helpful because they would ask you in the exam, they would label this equation and ask to complete a part of it or to answer some subparts of this step. So Al2O3.2H2 is known as impure bauxite, impure because it has impurities mixed into it, plus 2 NaOH, which is a base, and temperature is 150 to 200 degrees Celsius, which produces 2 NaOH, also known as sodium aluminate, and 3H2O. Okay. Now, the first point, bauxite is amphoteric oxide, reacts with base which is base is 2 NaOH, also known as sodium hydroxide, forming sodium aluminate and water. Impurities left behind are separated. Okay, now let's look at the next reaction. Before that, let's clear whatever we've noted down as yet. Let's look at the second reaction, NaLO2 plus 2H2O. So this would be sodium aluminate plus water at temperature 50 to 60 degrees Celsius gives NaOH plus AlOH thrice, which is a precipitate. So if you see this arrow pointing downwards, it means that the compound is a precipitate. Now what is the first point? The first point is sodium aluminate is diluted with H2O and crystals of aluminium hydroxide are added to it to further precipitate out aluminium hydroxide, a process called seeding. So all you need to do is just memorize this line. Moving on to the second line, insoluble aluminium hydroxide is filtered out and dried. Now because aluminium hydroxide is a precipitate, it is insoluble, so it is very easy to filter it out. Now let's move on to the third reaction. Aluminium hydroxide takes place at the temperature of 1100 degrees Celsius and gives pure alumina and water. Precipitated aluminium hydroxide is ignited to give pure alumina, which is Al2O3. Now what is the step 2? Step 2 is, let's study the electrolyte first. So what are the electrolytes? These are fused alumina. There is cryolite, Na3AlF6, and then you have fluorspar, and its chemical formula is CaF2. It would also be helpful if you note these down. Now the electrolytic cell consists of a rectangular steel tank with carbon lining. Rectangular steel tank with carbon lining. Okay, now let's scroll down a bit to look at the further information. Now what are the electrodes? Electrodes consist of the cathode and the anode. Now the cathode consists of carbon lining of the cell, and anode consists of thick carbon rods, which are mostly graphite, attached to copper clamps dipped in fused electrolytes, and the reaction temperature is 950 degrees Celsius. The current is 100 amperes, amps means amperes, at 6 to 7 volts. So this is the current and this is the voltage at which the reaction takes place. Electrolytic reaction. So what are the electrolytic reactions that are taking place inside the entire electrolytic cell? So you have cryolite, which ionizes into sodium, aluminium and fluorine. Then you have fluorspar, whose chemical formula is CaF2. So you have calcium and you have fluorine, calcium and fluorine ions, and then you finally have alumina, Al2O3, pure alumina. And note, all of these are reversible reactions. So even if you combine these ions on the right hand side, you would get the same chemical formulas as listed in the left hand side. Al2O3 gives 2Al3 plus. So this is basically ions. So if you look at these chemical formulas very carefully, you can note all the elements down, and those will be the ions that will be formed. Now the reaction at cathode, you have aluminium and you have 6 electrons which combine to form 2 molecules of aluminium. Then we have anode. Now what reaction takes place at anode? You have oxygen which combines with 6, which loses 6 electrons to give nascent oxygen. So if you find this type of representation of oxygen, so mostly you would be accustomed to this type of representation of oxygen, but if you encounter this type of representation, then this means nascent oxygen, and it is very, very reactive. So nascent oxygen turns into 3 molecules of oxygen. Now let's look at the note. Now what is the note? Aluminium ions are preferentially discharged. So please do remember this keyword, preferentially discharged, to Na plus and Ca2 plus ions due to its lower position in electrochemical series. So sodium and calcium are in the top 3 of the electrochemical series, while aluminium is somewhere in the middle. Okay, so let's scroll down a bit. So this is a rough figure that I've drawn. Products that are formed at the cathode are pure aluminium metal, and products that are formed at anode are oxygen gas. Now in cathode you have pure aluminium metal which settles down because it is lighter than the electrolyte. So this is the electrolyte, and this is the molten aluminium that settles down because it is heavier than the electrolyte, and then eventually it is collected at the a pot which basically consists of silvery molten aluminium. Now one more feature to note about electrolytic cell is that this is a slope, this is not a straight line, so that the molten aluminium that is collected below the electrolytic cell can be collected very easily. Okay, so let's move on. Now let's look at some features of this reaction. Al2O3 is highly stable oxide, and aluminium has a strong affinity for oxygen. So you have some compounds which have a special dislike for each other. So even if you can separate them very easily, but in case of Al2O3 they have a very strong affinity for each other, so it's very, very difficult to separate them. Therefore Al2O3 can be reduced to Al electrolytically only. Now fused alumina melts at around 2050 degrees Celsius, which is a very, very high temperature. At such high temperatures, so this is the first point, large amount of electrical energy is required, thus adding to energy costs. And the second point is, liberated aluminium metal may also tend to volatilize out and get wasted. So a question may be asked in your board exams that list the disadvantages that takes place at high temperatures in the electrolytic cell. So these are the 2 points that have to be listed down in the exam paper. And then we have addition of cryolite and fluorspar, mainly cryolite. So the first point is lowers melting point of mixture from 2050 degrees Celsius to 950 degrees Celsius. Enhances the mobility of the mixture and enhances the conductivity of the mixture, because pure alumina is almost a non-conductor of electricity. Okay, so let's scroll down. The difficulties faced during electrolytic reduction of aluminium was resolved by Charles Hall, remember the scientist's name, in 1886. Layer of powdered coke is sprinkled over this electrolytic mixture. So if we just scroll down a bit, if we scroll up a bit, so this covering is sprinkled coke. These black coverings that you can see, these are sprinkled cokes, and let's see why they are applied. So they are applied because it prevents burning of carbon electrodes in air and minimizes or prevents heat loss by radiation. Carbon rods or graphite are continuously replaced during electrolysis, since oxygen evolved at the anode reacts with carbon anode, because oxygen is very, very reactive. Carbon anode is thus oxidized to carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. Carbon anode is thus consumed. So this is very important keyword, do mention it in the exam. Carbon anode is thus consumed and replaced periodically.